if you've noticed, some of the way we've sort of structured some of this is not only to look at the science of that forms the basis of, if you will, why we are compassionate and how the brain responds to it, but we've also now looked a bit at the education system and its potential impact and looked at some of those effects. We have looked at healthcare a little bit to give a little brief overview of that and some of the problems that we are struggling with in the healthcare environment. And this next session, which I think will be particularly useful, is business and the economy. And it's interesting, and Monica and I were discussing this a bit earlier, how when organizations actually incorporate the values of compassion within their organization, oftentimes this has a profound effect both on shareholder value but also profitability. And it's interesting, as we sort of let the rest of the folks settle in here, it's interesting, I was at a conference in Australia, and there was a CEO of a major company in Australia, and he was commenting about, do you guys know what a 360 review is? Right. So he was the CEO, very large company. He got his 360 review, and the person who ran it said, you know, we have to tell you, we did not think it was possible, but you have had the worst review of the history of our organization. And he said that's impossible. Because, you know, when you're in charge of things, it's your opinion, right? So he said, that's impossible. Obviously, this is not a valid. And he was actually thinking of firing them. But before he did that, what he did was he went to home, and he told his wife about this ridiculous review about him. And he said, what do you think of that? And she looked at him and she said, well, they're right. And he said, what are you talking about? And she says, well, I've been telling you that for 20 years, you just never listened. And the interesting thing about this shows you the quality of this person ultimately, though, when he did become self-aware, was he actually sent his review out to his organization and asked the company, members of the company, what he could do to improve. And over a period of time, he had a complete 180, or I hope it's 180, not a 360, 180-degree turnaround, and now he actually has become a Tibetan Buddhist, believe it or not, and has imbued this type of philosophy in this organization, and it's had a profound impact such that they meet these incredible metrics in terms of individual satisfaction and individual performance within the organization. So it's an incredible story, and that's what's possible when you incorporate these values. So maybe we can bring out our next panelist, Monica Worline, who I think you've met, will be moderating this panel, and it's Advancing Compassion in the Economy and in Business, and it's really got individuals on the panel who I'm big admirers of, and I'm really looking forward to hearing them, and I'm sure you will enjoy their talks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Welcome back from what a great poster session. And I was in the lunchroom, which was just buzzing. I was very happy to see the high quality interactions, what my colleague Jane Dutton calls high quality connections happening. This panel I'm very excited to hear because we face as a country and as a globe growing inequality, and we see a widening gap in distribution of wealth, which some of you may have seen research tells us that also widens the gap in compassion, because we know from research on empathy that it's easier to empathize with others that we see as more similar to ourselves. And as our panelists will show us, there's new research that documents that this inequality gap may contribute to what Paul Piff, our panelist, is calling the empathy gap as well. I don't believe that we have any actual economists doing economic research on our panel today, but we can set that intention for next year and dream about the day that we have economists involved in this conversation about advancing business and the economy with compassion. The good news is that there are many places in the world emphasizing business as a force for social good and social change, and as that drive gains momentum, this conversation between academics and business leaders is one that is going to continue to grow in richness and importance. And we are very lucky to be here at some of the first of its kind of these conversations to take place. So welcome to Advancing Compassion in Business and the Economy. And our first speaker will be Paul Piff.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here. It's really a great pleasure and honor to have the opportunity to talk to you today about some of our research. And of course, thanks so much to Monica and Jim and the other organizers of this tremendous conference. It's really a landmark conference bringing together so many different kinds of interests and people, and it's a great pleasure of mine. I'd be remiss without first thanking the tremendous team that I've had the honor of working with. You'll see some faces up there that you might recognize. And of course, it's an entirely 100% kudos to them that I'm up here, and I deserve none of the recognition. I am a social psychologist, and in particular, one of the things that I'm really interested in is an understanding the psychological processes by which people shift focus away from themselves toward the needs of others, toward the needs of the groups that they belong to and the social collectives that they're a part of, and conversely, orient to themselves and really prioritize their own interests, their own desires, their own values, their own goals. One of the ways that I've gotten really interested in looking at this really basic question is in understanding and highlighting the role of social stratification and social hierarchy in shaping the ways in which people think about themselves, think about others, and behave toward one another. Really highlighting and specifically examining the role of status differences and material differences. How does money, how do different levels of wealth shape people's patterns of social behavior? One of the things that we've been finding, and this is across, at this point, upwards of 40 different studies, thousands of participants all over this country and all over the world, is as people's levels of wealth and status in society increase, their feelings of compassion and empathy actually go down. And instead, their feelings of entitlement, their feelings of deservingness, their ideology of self-interest, their moralization of greed increase. What I want to do today is talk to you about some of the implications of this work, some of what we've been finding, and relate it to the business, the economy, and perhaps even our everyday lives. So one of the initial tests of this in our lab came from a colleague of mine, Jenny Steller, who was really interested in just basic differences in how those that have and those that don't, wealth differences in compassion. So in one of the studies, just to give you an example of how she went about doing this, she had participants all over the country complete a standard measure of compassion where they just report their everyday feelings of compassion, indicating their agreement with statements like, it's important to take care of people who are vulnerable. When I see someone hurt or in need, I feel a powerful urge to take care of them. And she found this negative relationship. The wealthier you are, the less likely you are to report feeling these kinds of things. Moving beyond self-report, here's one of my favorite demonstrations of this. She actually brought participants into the lab and had them watch a video designed to elicit compassion, a video depicting a child diagnosed with cancer. And she just watched and monitored with physiological recording devices what their bodies did as they watched this video. The poorer group of participants showed decreased signs of compassion, heart rate deceleration, relative to their wealthier counterparts, suggesting that wealth differences in compassion may be observable in people's bodily reactions, physiological reactions to the social world. Now, in my own work, I've really been interested in examining if there are wealth differences in empathy, what the implications of this might be for a whole host of different behavioral processes, looking at wealth differences in behavior across a variety of different contexts. In one of the studies, I was really interested in just different levels of generosity, if those might exist among people that have and those that don't. And so really just asking the question, who's going to behave more generously? Someone who's rich or someone who's poor? To test this, I brought participants from the broader community into the lab and gave each of them, this is just a standard measure of economic generosity, I gave each of them the equivalent of $10. And I said they could keep these $10, or if they wanted to, they could decide to share a portion of those $10 with a partner that they'd been paired with in the study, a stranger, someone they'd never met, someone who'd never meet them, totally anonymous. And we just recorded and measured how many of these dollars participants gave away. The wealthier you were, the less you gave. This is controlling for a number of other things: political orientation, religiosity, age, ethnicity, gender. The wealthier the participant was, the smaller the portion of dollars he or she gave away. In fact, participants making under $15,000 a year gave 44% more of their money away than did participants making $200,000 a year or more. A considerable difference. We've looked at cheating behavior, whether someone is more or less inclined to cheat as a function of how much they have. In one of these studies, we actually rigged a computer game so that die rolls over a certain total were impossible. You couldn't get above 12 in this repeated die roll game that the computer was playing for you. And yet, we gave participants the opportunity to report their score to us. The wealthier you were, the more likely you were to over-report scores that were impossible to get, just to increase your chances of winning a $50 Amazon.com gift certificate. We ran another study where we looked at how much candy participants would be willing to take from a jar of candy that we explicitly identified, even with a label on the jar, as being reserved for children participating in studies at a developmental lab nearby. Unbeknownst to participants, we just track how much candy they took. Participants who felt rich took 2 times as much candy as participants who felt poor. We've studied cars, whether drivers of different kinds of cars are more or less inclined to break the law. In one of these studies, we actually posed researchers looking like pedestrians at crosswalks and had coders hidden behind bushes coding the expensiveness of different vehicles. Is that a Toyota or is that a Mercedes? Coding the expensiveness of different vehicles as they came down the roadway, and then recording whether or not the driver of that car stopped for our pedestrian, which in California, as you all know, is the law. It's the law to stop for a pedestrian, yield the right of way to allow the pedestrian to cross. Here's an example of how we did this. This is our Confederate off to the left, stopping at the crosswalk as the driver of the red truck proceeds to stop. Now our poor pedestrian's almost run over by the bus. And here's a more expensive car, a Prius, driving right through, and a BMW doing the same. We did this repeatedly for hundreds of different vehicles on many different days. And what we found is that when you broke the data down by vehicle expensiveness category, there was this significant positive linear trend. The more expensive the car that you were driving was, the more likely you were, in this study, to break the law. Note, none of the cars in our least expensive car category violated the law, but close to 50% of those most expensive car drivers did so. Lest you think this is just an epiphenomenon of some crazy Bay Area driving, I was just sent these data a few months ago by Jeremy Boyd at UC San Diego. He had coders code behavior at 50 upwards of 50 different intersections all over the state, thousands of different vehicles, very similar pattern of results. We've run other studies finding that wealthier participants are more likely to lie in negotiations and endorse unethical behavior in the workplace, like stealing cash from the cash register, accepting bribes, and lying to customers. Now, in more recent work, some collaborators of mine, Liz Horberg and Benoit Monin and I, have been interested in uncovering whether there are really fundamental differences between wealthy and less wealthy people in how they construe themselves, define what's of value and what's of meaning in their lives. And in fact, when you ask people what's important to how you see yourself as a person, poorer participants are significantly more likely to identify what's of value as being a moral and ethical person. And by contrast, wealthier individuals are significantly more likely to derive their esteem, to root their self-worth in how much they achieve, in how competitive they are, and how much they stand out from the pack. So, what are the critical implications of this work? And importantly, what relevance do they have to the business community, to the economy, and maybe even to our own lives? Well, a lot of the work that I've been talking about suggests this relationship between having money, making money, and a prioritization of self-interest. And we confront this in business all the time, where a need for profit, a drive for self-interest, is a driving force. It's often a necessity. The problem is that when self-interest is prioritized above all else, when the concerns of others are not a concern of yours, the costs can significantly outweigh the gains. There's a lot of research coming out of labs at Harvard, Stanford, all over the world, showing that for groups, for organizations, for collectives, the best long-term strategies are ones of cooperation and compassion. Groups that do that well do better. Individuals that do those things well do better as well. Sure, it can make a lot of sense to do everything that you can right here, right now, to maximize your own interests. But in the long run, think about it, that's a really poor strategy, because the trust, the bonds, the support that you, we, our communities, and our groups all rely on inevitably fall away. So what can be done? Well, in our own work, we find that it often doesn't take much. In fact, we found that small psychological interventions, little nudges in people's social values, can have big behavioral effects. Fleeting reminders of the benefits of cooperation or the advantages of community can significantly, we found, restore levels of egalitarianism among the wealthy. In one study, we had participants watch a brief 46-second long video about child poverty all over the world, which served as a fleeting reminder of the needs of others. Following watching this video, 45 minutes later to an hour later, they were given the opportunity to help a stranger in distress that they met in the lab, someone who was visibly worried, visibly anxious, visibly in need of help, and we gave them the opportunity to help this other person out. Whereas participants in our control condition, who didn't watch that compassion video, showed the same wealth differences we'd seen before, poorer participants gave significantly more of their own minutes to help out this other person than did their wealthier counterparts. What happened when participants watched that compassion video is that that wealth difference went away. Wealthier individuals became just as helping, just as oriented to the needs of this other person, just as willing to give up their own valued resources, their own time, to help out the stranger as their less well-off peers. To conclude, the Nobel laureate and economist Milton Friedman is famously quoted as having said that the sole social responsibility of business, and by implication an individual, is to do everything that it can to maximize profits, as long as it stays within the rules of the game, as long as it stays within the rules of the game. So as long as it engages in maximizing profits without doing anything fraudulent or deceptive. The problem is that when a greed for profit is the bottom line, those rules, those ethical principles that we all rely on, fall by the wayside. So the task before us is to somehow find a way to bring together our interest in profits with the needs of others. Can we bring together these two seemingly incompatible motivations and make them compatible? Well, I think we can through even small acts of compassion, small acts of mindfulness toward others, because there's every reason to think that by doing so, you would not only be improving the welfare of other people, but also in the long run, bettering yourself and improving your own well-being. It doesn't necessarily take much, but it's certainly in our best interests, I believe, to do so. Thank you all.
So I think that sets the stage for seeing and understanding the aching need that we have in our society for leaders in business and global organization to talk openly about the importance of compassion and to embrace research like this and to begin to change the narrative among their peers and their companions in the business world. And that's just one of the reasons I'm so delighted to invite Scott Kriens to take the podium next. The other reason I'm delighted is that I've heard him speak many times in the past, and he is always a very, very inspiring and illuminating speaker. So he will speak to us about the value of authenticity and authentic relationships.
So I don't know about you, but on the intersections on the way out of here, I'm going to be scanning for these monitors to make sure I'm not part of that violating crowd. It's very interesting commentary. The perspective that I'll share is really kind of picking up on a little bit of what Paul said, but mapping into the business community that at least is part of where I come from and work that we do, and then it makes its way into a larger agenda. This central premise of what I believe, and by the way, I should also say, there's only, I'm the least educated person on this panel, so this comes with no research and little evidence except my own. But in that 35 years of being in business in one dimension or another, it took me a while. In fact, actually, it took more than a while. It took an incident in my own life, which was the passing of my father, and that was about 10 years ago, to stop and ask, why do all this? I mean, to what end? And that's its own journey for another conversation. But one of the things that led me to was to believe that the leadership development agenda and the development of people in business was actually a better use of time than the business itself. Because the best way I could contribute, having at the time being a CEO of a company that was growing, was to try and figure out how to grow the people in the company instead of trying to grow the company, because growing the people would scale. And so one of the most memorable things that was said to me in getting some advice on how one would go about doing that is that no one really cares. The advice was, no one cares what you say until they know who you are. And to boil that down to that, and what I thought was becoming the formula for it all, it led to this notion of authenticity. And my definition of authenticity is when someone tells you something that they believe instead of telling you something that they want you to believe. And it's different than honesty, because what they want you to believe in that case might well be what they believe as well. But if the agenda or the intention, if you will, that comes into the interaction is to make you believe something or make the audience believe something or the recipient, we're all, as Malcolm Gladwell calls it, the thin slice. We take a thin slice. We take a quick look and we ask ourselves, which of those two things is going on here? And if it's something a person truly believes, then we have in my opinion, we have a predisposition to lean into that, because there might be something real happening that's worth listening to. On the other hand, if we think that we're being told something that the speaker is trying to make us believe, then I'm going to lean away from that. And so my early work in this leadership development agenda was that it was really about authenticity. Well, it created a step that was a predecessor or a prerequisite of that, which is it's not possible to be authentic without self-awareness. Because if I don't know who I am, it's not really possible to show up and represent that. And that's, of course, a lifelong journey. The subject of, perhaps Meng will touch on that, others that have spent lifetimes on the teachings of that. But it's a critical prerequisite, and the commitment of time to inquire into that self-awareness and self-discovery precedes the ability to come in and show up authentically. And why would that have a contribution to make in the business world? Well, if a leader can be authentic and does have an audience that's willing to lean into that person, then what they earn the opportunity to create is trust. And I think that trust is the central ingredient to the creation of value. And it's actually quite a, I didn't really think this was going to be the case, but it's quite a timely thing. Because about 6 hours ago, standing in front of, I'm still the chairman of the company that I was, and I'm not any longer the CEO of. And it's a 9,000 person company, and I stood in front of that company this morning and introduced a new CEO. And we talked about the company values and why this person who's been at the company for 17 years is the CEO of this company as of an announcement that we made yesterday, and what was central to the value of the company. And the answer to that question is because he's a walking, talking example of trust. And why is that valuable? Well, when we started our company 17 years ago, there was about 40 other companies, 40 or 50 more, doing the same thing, same undertaking. And all of them are gone today but one. And so the question one would ask is, well, why is that? And there's, for sake of simplification, there's two possibilities. One is maybe we're smarter. But it's likely, as soon as you make the group larger than a couple, certainly by the time you get to 10 or 100, and obviously way before you get to 9,000, if the premise of success is I'm going to find 9,000 smarter people than the competitor and the 9,000 people they're going to bring on board, or 900 or 90 or probably even 9, the chances that your formula for success is going to be built on finding smarter people than the others trying to do the same thing is 0. So then if that's not it, what is it? And this is not my quote, it's borrowed, but there's a quote that trust has economic value. And the economic value of it is that in two groups, because you can make one assumption, I'm probably capable of hiring 900 or 900 people that are at least as smart. So we're probably not going to hire stupider people. So let's just say people are equal by the time you get to any significant number. Well, then how is one group going to do better than another if they're all smart and they're all trying to do the same thing? Well, what trust makes possible is more rapid iterations. Because if any group, any person is working on something, you're going to learn some things, and in the process of then trying them, there'll be some discoveries, and there'll be some mistakes, and then we'll iterate the next time around and learn a little more, and then we'll put that to work on the next time around, and so forth. Well, the only way that that's going to happen is if it's in a trusted environment where we can admit our mistakes. So it takes an enormous amount of trust in a group to be able to say, I got that wrong. In fact, I don't even really maybe know what I'm doing. I've got some ideas, but they don't seem to be working and I need some help. It takes a lot of trust in a group to be able to do that. It takes even more trust in a group to be able to say to somebody else in the group, I think you got that wrong. And to have that be a positive, iterative learning experience. Very difficult. But if it happens, what two groups of equally smart people starting on the same problem at the same time will do is they'll try something, they'll learn, they'll try something else, they'll learn again, and they'll try some more. The group that brings more trust into that exercise is going to share more freely, learn more quickly, and iterate more successfully. And so if they do over multiple iterations, they'll end up either having an advantage in maintaining it if they did figure something out first, or just finding something out along the way and turning it into the next release of something faster than the other guys doing the same thing. So the notion that trust has economic value is not ethereal. It's a practical, tangible, dynamic condition that can be accomplished within a team as long as conscious intention to serve that purpose is brought to the exercise. And the final piece of the development formula, following self-awareness and then authenticity and then trust, is that if that exists, if all three of those things exist, the opportunity earned for the final piece of the puzzle is inspiration. And inspiration born in a trusted environment, in our definition of it, meaning the company, but also in the foundation that we've started since then, is a condition which creates what we call generative energy. And generative energy is the kind which creates more than it consumes. And it's contrasted with what we call toxic energy. So, and probably we've all had these experiences. When you go to work on something that you're really energized by, or you get around a group of people, it's possible to work all day and all night and wake up in the morning with more energy to go do it again. And to the degree we're tired, once we get back into that dynamic with that group, the energy comes back. And by contrast, it's also possible to work 2 hours a day on something we're truly discouraged about with a group of people that we don't feel that way and aren't trusting, and be completely exhausted. And so the ultimate purpose of the work is to create communities of compassionate people, and I'll talk about compassion in a second with only a few minutes to go, so I don't take too much of the other group's time, but to bring these generative communities together. The leader's responsibility in that is to be a steward of that energy, to cultivate and show up, first of all, show up authentically, and then cultivate the trust intentionally. And by doing that, it's possible to create a community or a team that is a source of generative energy for itself. And so this is a belief I have, and there's on another day with more time, a lot of things we believe in and say and attempt to be stewards of every day. The work that kind of came out of that, and what caused me to step out of that day-to-day role and into the work that we're doing at the foundation, which is called 1440, which is named for the number of minutes in a day, is around a mission which we, what we would say is the mission of the foundation in 1440 is compassionate communities leading generative lives. And the notion is that compassion is actually not something to instill. It's a natural intention that's resident in all of us. And the way I'll make that back into a comment to point out something that Paul was telling us is you can see it in the work. You know, when you make it visible and create the opportunity, it surfaces on its own. It's very natural, and I have a larger view of it, which is that we actually all share a source and a place of origin. And so compassion for others is actually just an extension of compassion for self, because ultimately, at least in my view, there's really only one self, and it's the origin of all things. And so to be compassionate for someone else is not that different than looking after myself, which is the most natural thing that we all do. But the rest of it gets cluttered and lost because, in my untested, unproven opinion, we get away from that self-awareness and that authenticity, and we get caught up in what we want people to think about who we are. And the further we get from showing up authentically as who we really are and letting go of the outcomes of the judgments that others might pass on that, and being simply content that this is it, for better or worse, and then lean in to those relationships with others, the more likely it is for that compassion to come to the surface naturally, because in my opinion, it's in there. And so the original work that we did in the company was meant to try and bring this notion of trust as a contributor of economic value to the quality of and the productivity of teams. And then as we thought about it more, and as I started to ask a question that would never go away after this sort of change in my life 10 years ago, which is what are you really doing that's worth doing? It wasn't enough to do that in just a work setting. And so the origins of 1440 and the work that we do now is around the observation that this notion of authentic relationship, it doesn't just belong in a leadership development course, it's a life skill. And it's not a mysterious thing. Relationship is a verb, and authenticity is an intentional accomplishment that's achievable by everyone because it's in there. And if we bring that to our personal lives, whether it's our personal relationships, whether it's with our children, whether it's teachers bringing it to the classroom, as Tish Jennings probably talked about here earlier, it's a teachable life skill that can be brought personally into what we do in our lives. It can be brought professionally into the workplace, and it has this, in my opinion, it has this need to be demystified because it can be taught. It can be learned and it can be taught, and there's programs doing it that many people here, I'm going to guess, know a lot more about than I do, but it's the work that we're trying to do because to the degree that we can cause pockets of this to exist in the world, whether it's in a workplace or in a classroom or in a couples workshop or in a meditation retreat or a contemplative pursuit, bringing all of that to the assignment of being authentic and taking that authenticity into relationship is at least the formula that we're trying to stimulate for causing compassion, which is natural in all of us, to come to the surface, which when you put that into a community, and we define community as a place where more happens than would be possible by any one member of it, that those compassionate communities are capable of leading generative lives, and those are lives that create more energy than they consume. And it's not an easy thing. Perhaps it's easier to stand up here and say it than it is to do it, but it's possible to do it in pockets and to do what we call serving champions that are doing it all around the country in all kinds of places. And as that happens in those places, one will connect to another, will connect to another, and the opportunity to see these communities flourish will be generative. So with no research and no proof, that's my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you. So, generative energy is a wonderful expression to capture what I feel when I have the chance to interact with Dan Martin, our next speaker. I always feel more engaged and enlivened after I have the chance to talk with him and hear about his very resourceful research. I don't know exactly what aspect of that research he'll talk with us about today, but I hope he will at least mention his research about the way that ideologies play into our expressions of compassion that will build on our conversation. And Dan, since we've had a chance to hear from you once before at this conference, and I now get to be more informal, I want to give you a tip. I know that you often use econ majors at Cal State East Bay as a foil, but I believe if Wikipedia is a reliable source, that you are sitting next to an econ major from Cal State East Bay. So you may want to choose a different group to use as your straw man for today's talk. Thank you, Dan.
Yes, it's true. I'll stay away from that today. But I do want to share some stuff that is very different from the work that I was talking about yesterday. Thank you all for the opportunity to be here. Thank you to Jim and to CCARE. Thank you to Monica. And for my fellow panelists, this is a great setup, so I'm going to let it rip. And, you know, just like yesterday, I'm going to hit you hard. So I know it's after lunch. It's cool. We'll wake up. Here we go. We suffer. You're suffering. We're all suffering at some point in time. I like to think about suffering from large-scale perspectives before we go into kind of micro perspectives. So when we think about suffering, oftentimes it's very strongly related to inequality. Have you ever read a great book called The Spirit Level, ladies and gentlemen? It's by a group of British demographers and epidemiologists that look at inequality in society, not only across developed nations, but also in states in the United States, usually across a bunch of different epidemiological variables. So I'm going to run through these kind of quick, but I want you to just take a look at these things. If you look at the very bottom of the screen, you'll notice that the United States is all the way to the left, and Sweden, I know we have a couple Swedes here, yes, you can shout out at some point, is in the, it looks like a dark blue. So let's go ahead and start taking a look at World Bank inequality ratings, and we can see that Sweden and Japan are actually very equitable compared to the United States. We look at social mobility, people's ability to move between different socioeconomic strata. The United States is close to the bottom, with Britain being at the bottom. Life expectancy, in terms of these developed nations, the United States is last. When we look at things like teenage pregnancy, we're winning. I don't know if that's a good thing. In terms of obese and overweight adult males, we're in the last place there. In terms of infant mortality, in terms of the murder rate per 100,000 people, in the last place. The prison population is gargantuan here in the United States. The poverty rate, we're on top as well. You can see all these are related to some element of suffering. And I just want us to pause for a moment, because we've been talking about compassion from so many different perspectives. But when we add a lack of compassion up, I think sometimes these are the kinds of phenomena we witness in society. Income difficulties, people finding it difficult to find jobs. We have a tough time here. And voting rates, the one thing we can do to change some of these issues. How many of you voted in the election the other day? Oh, I love you people. Thank you. I appreciate that. I'll check for stickers later. Thanks. And trust, the very thing that Scott was just talking about, is minimal here in the United States. And I'm going to argue that's for a couple different reasons that we hope to mitigate by virtue of some of the packages that we've created, like compassion development dyads. But we'll talk a little bit about some of the research behind that. We know that the United States is changing dramatically as well in terms of our own demographic change, or norms, I should say. So we find this represented in a lot of different places. It's not a bad thing. It's not a good thing. It is what it is. However, when we start looking at at companies in Silicon Valley, we see really non-representative populations. Some of you have been following this kind of interesting situation in terms of racial and sex representation in the big firms in Silicon Valley. Here's a representation of Apple, predominantly male and Anglo. Here's represented Yahoo, same thing. It's the same thing, sorry, Google. It's the same thing at Facebook. So the key here is this will play a role maybe in terms of some of the work that we'll talk about in terms of ideology quite shortly, in terms of systems justification. So let's talk a tiny bit about compassion. We've already spoken about this. This is the second day of conference. We define it simply as awareness of someone's suffering, the empathic feeling of that person's pain, and then some sort of action to ameliorate this. For those of you who've already seen these pictures, you can withhold the "ah," but for those of you who haven't seen these pictures, feel free to do so. That's, of course, a definition from Monica. This is my daughter and her grandmother. She was feeling really sad, so Grandma tried to make her laugh, but that didn't work, so she did the next thing, which is she tried to comfort her, a very sweet thing. That didn't work. So what do you do when things like this don't work? You do more of it. So Grandpa came over and started giving her the attention she needed, and when he, listening to her, couldn't affect change, gave her the gratuitous hug. Thank you. Yeah. So the effect is there. So the goals in terms of understanding compassion have a lot to do with how we define it, but as we spoke and as Dr. Gilbert so eloquently pointed out today, there are a great deal of blocks to compassion. Really simply, these are going to play into the research that I'm about to share with you, so I just want to remind you, this comes from Gilbert's Fears of Compassion scale. There's 3 components to it, really: fear of expressing compassion for others, fear of receiving compassion from others, and then finally, fear of expressing compassion for yourself. We'll stop for a moment, and I will not say anything about students coming from the dismal science, oh, sorry, or any other science for that matter. No, I apologize. But when we think about students and their choices in terms of what helped them to determine what they wanted to study, why did you guys decide to go into medicine? Why did you decide to go into psychology, into healthcare? There must have been some reasons that were behind this. Some people would argue that these are individual differences or personological. So I do some work in a construct called social dominance orientation, and really what it refers to in simple terms is people's preference for maintaining hierarchies in society. It tends to break out in 2 specific ways. One would be group-based dominance, which is similar to maybe ethnocentrism. The other component is just a preference for that individual really being on top. The interesting thing about this is it relates strongly to a lot of things that we generally don't talk about in terms of some of the bad things that are going on in society, like sexism, racism, and your preference for watching Fox News. Oh, political, economic conservatism. But the reality of the situation is it's also very strongly related to people's vocational choices. So when students do choose disciplines, oftentimes it's a reflection of their preference for maintaining hierarchy in society. So we can see these differences in disciplines between the humanities, between the social sciences, between business, etc., things like this. It's interesting because people who have a high level of social dominance orientation tend to lean towards organizations that also manifest hierarchies. So we'll go into detail about that shortly. So the last piece that came out about this, I spoke about briefly yesterday, it's in the Journal of Business Ethics, but we were looking at the impact of fears of compassion as it related to things like social dominance orientation. So we established these high links between social dominance orientation and, as you would expect, low levels of compassion for others, as well as increased fears of compassion, not only for giving compassion to others, also receiving compassion for others, and importantly, fears of receiving compassion or giving compassion to oneself. Now, this becomes extremely frightening because this is also associated with higher levels of depression, anxiety, and stress. Now, if you work in a very hierarchical organization, you notice this, you see this, because on the tops of organizations, oftentimes you have behavior that's associated with creating depression, anxiety, and stress. It may very well be that these people are manifesting it at high levels for themselves as well, and the very things that would ameliorate their own suffering, that would help them address their pains through compassion, they're preventing from due to these blocks that Dr. Gilbert was talking about. Now, here's where things get really dicey. I'm also really interested in ideology as it mediates the impact of social dominance orientation. And living in a capitalist society, of course, I'm very interested in the words of Milton Friedman. It was nice to see a picture of him. I haven't seen that in a while. So we established the partially mediating effect of adherence to free market ideology, which exacerbates these levels of stress, anxiety, and depression. So what this is saying is that people who have a high preference for maintaining hierarchy in society, if they really are strong adherents to free market ideology, they're going to be that much more stressed out. They're going to be that much more depressed and anxious. So it's kind of interesting, you know, we shore ourselves up in the social environment, and our own preferences may be exacerbated by our own social environment. So, that's something that we should probably be thinking about. And, you know, we talked a lot about values today in the healthcare component, and values affirmation is critical, and understanding one's values are critical. So thinking about how that plays a role, not only in terms of ideology, but also in terms of how it represents itself behaviorally becomes critical. So really quickly, let's talk about the 3 effective systems that Dr. Gilbert was talking about. And we can see that there's 3, and this will become important shortly. When we think about them, we'll give you a work example. We could say that the drive system may be exemplified by a work goal, and we're really trying to accomplish something, like doing a good presentation on time. The fear system could be being scared that one would make reference to economics students after being warned. And the soothing and safety system would be the laughter from kind audience members who are caring and considerate. This becomes problematic because while our drive system is fully represented, while our anxiety system is fully represented, our soothing system really isn't addressed usually, especially when you've had too much coffee. So when you think about these systems and how they usually look for people in the real world, the threat system is usually quite large, and there's a little bit of a drive system, but our soothing system is tiny. And this becomes really scary. We need to find ways to relax. One way of doing that, we've argued, is through the dyadic interactions of the compassion development dyads. We're working on that. Now, this is a large set of teeth. I bring this up for a very specific reason, because I used to work for the military, and when I worked for the military, I did a lot of work on workplace violence. And I'll just throw out a quick question. What's the best predictor of another person's willingness to kill another person? The size of their teeth. That's a great guess. No, it's the first time I've heard that. Any other ones, really quick? Fear? So it's actually proximity, and that's why we've used ranged weapons as long as there's been human beings, right? And why the picture of the big teeth? Over the past 20 years, and I check every 10 years, 6,000 Americans are bitten in the workplace by their colleagues. And the reason I bring that up is because our preference for attacking people using ranged weapons tells you how stressed American employees are. They're actually biting each other. They're putting their teeth on each other. Their levels of stress are absurd. So let's finish this up and talk a little bit about corporate social responsibility as it relates to social dominance orientation. When we look at social dominance orientation, it also relates to people's preference to various types of corporate social responsibility, and of course in the workplace this becomes very important. So we find that higher levels of social dominance orientation are related to low levels of ecological concerns, low levels of preference for government regulation of business, low levels of philanthropy, low levels of obligation to the public, as well as a positive relationship to materialistic greed. The people who make it to the top oftentimes may be in a position to affect these types of policies that the company is bringing forward, but may not have the inclination to actually do anything about it. So I'll just share with you kind of a fun little intervention that we did a couple years ago. Because I was doing a lot of work for the federal government, I have some experience with corporate, with I should say organizational assessment and organizational climate. So I was talking to a student, and the student was asking me if I knew anything about crime maps. Have you guys ever seen crime maps? Okay, so he said, wouldn't it be cool if we could map compassion? And I said, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. How would you do that? But then it got under my skin, and I started thinking about it, and I started thinking about the kinds of variables that come from climate surveys, in particular student climate surveys, which are used for accreditation purposes. High levels of student stress and poor results on student climate surveys are related to things like GPA, minority student participation, minority faculty participation, things of this sort. So I started plucking variables from student climate surveys and thought maybe the best way to implement a tool like this would be to capitalize on having people witness this. I think Serena was talking about elevation yesterday. And elevation is an outward-facing emotion where you witness something positive, and you have your own kind of desire to behavioral model positive behavior. So we use this as our theoretical underpinning, and what we did is we chose some student climate variables, easy ones: ethnic group collaboration, mentoring, courtesy, opening doors. And we decided to plug these things into a Google map. Actually, it's Ushahidi, it's open source, you guys can use it. The long and short of this is I broke two groups of students out. One group was a control group. They had some pre and post measures I'll describe in a few seconds, as well as a control group, a manipulation group. Those are the people who actually did this mapping. I just gave them the variables and I said, look guys, go out 5 days, witness one of these variables a day, and let me know how you feel. So this is the map. This is the Bay Area. You can see that's Cal State East Bay, right over there in Hayward. It's actually a very beautiful campus. I don't know what my students were doing. I told them only to do this on campus. You can see these dots are everywhere. They represent pro-sociality. Some were obviously canoeing. You also have this swath of red everywhere. I know it looks like Ebola right now, but it's not the case. And And when you dive in a little bit deeper, you can see that students were actually caring for each other. When you click into this, the students are going to tell you what actually happened. There was a classmate who was very sick and left the classroom. A student accompanied him to make sure everything is okay. So we can manipulate this. We can change our framing. Usually we're watching the news in the morning. We're feeling very upset about the horrors of the world. Instead, we can give ourselves opportunities to shift gears a tiny bit. What were some of the preliminary outcomes? Well, after 5 days of observing pro-social compassionate behavior, we established significantly higher levels of flourishing, as well as compassion for others. We had lower levels of depression in the manipulation group, as well as anxiety and stress. It's critical to let you know I did this right in the middle of midterms, which is a time when people are very anxious and very stressed out. So I'll leave you with a couple thoughts. It's very intimidating to speak among such luminaries as are here, but I wanted to leave you with an example of the giants of compassion really lifting up people. And here they are. That's Dr. Zimbardo, Dr. Doty, and Dr. Gilbert, and that's actually me that they were picking up. So it was a wonderful opportunity to be inspired. Thank you guys so much. Have a great night.
Our next presenter, Meng Tan, is one of Google's earliest engineers, author of a wonderful book, Search Inside Yourself. If you have the opportunity to interact with him, one of his favorite questions is, what do you want to be when you grow up? So just prepare your answer. Start now. And as I was thinking about the organizing of this panel, deliberately chose to place Meng as the final speaker on the panel because I certainly, and I think no one else on the panel, would want to be in the position of following him because he's quite funny, and his motto is that life is too important to be taken seriously. Thank you for being here.
Good afternoon, my friends. Sorry I'm stuck behind the podium. I mean, usually I like to walk with a mic, but so that I'll be vulnerable to you when you throw rotten tomatoes at me. So now I'm protected. Sorry if you are going to throw tomatoes at me. I'm going to duck. So my friends, when it comes to compassion in the context of business, I think there are three important things we need to know. Just three. And the three important things are that compassion is fun, is profitable, and is highly trainable. So first, compassion is fun. It is fun because it is the happiest state ever measured in the history of neuroscience. Science. See, it comes with an echo. That's how cool it is. Compassion is the happiest state ever measured. And I think most of you know the story behind this. Right? It's a story of this guy called Matthew Ricard. He's a French guy, ironically. Did I just say ironically? He's French. He has a PhD in microbiology, and then he became a monk, and he has 40,000 hours of meditation training. So Matthew became the first person with 40,000 hours of meditation training to be put in an fMRI machine. And the study was done by Richie and Antoine, people that some of you know. And since this was the first study, they didn't really know what they were looking for. So they was like, well, meditate on compassion, see what happens. Okay. And yeah, it sounds like a joke, but that's actually what happened. so Matthew did that. And a couple of things happened. The first thing that happened was that something really amazing. You see a spike in a certain part of his brain. And when I look at it, I'm a layperson. I didn't know what it meant. So I asked Richie, like, what does this mean? Richie says, imagine this. Imagine an elephant charging at you, right? That much emotionality. Seeing an elephant charging at you. Imagine the positive side of that experience. Being able to bring that up voluntarily in 1 second. That's what Matthew can do. That's the first thing Matthew can do. The second thing that the numbers show is that Matthew's happiness level was completely off the charts. Something like 8 standard deviations or something ridiculous. like completely off the charts. So the story went that when Antoine and Richie saw the data, there was only one conclusion. There's really only one reasonable conclusion, which is there's something wrong with the equipment. So they stopped the experiment. Sorry, Matthew, they pulled him out. So they pulled up Matthew and they checked. Turns out there was nothing wrong. Matthew replicated that, and it was replicated by the other monks who came to do that same experiment. So it turns out that compassion is the happiest state ever. And that's really important for all of us in this room. It's important for us to reframe compassion. Because we have the impression that compassion is painful, it's difficult, it's for heroes, it's for people like Scott. Right? Or saints, like the Dalai Lama, or both, right? Some combination of both. However, if we realize that compassion is fun, compassion is happy, it's a positive state, it's something that benefits yourself, then suddenly it becomes highly accessible. Then it can be scaled massively. So that's the first thing we need to understand, that it is conducive, it's highly conducive to happiness. So that's one. The second thing about compassion is that it is profitable. And it's profitable because it is a competitive advantage in business. The first place it shows up is in leadership. And there's research behind that, by the way. I'm not just pointing to Scott, but there's also real data. Yeah, something about Cal State. There was a study done, and it was written up in a book called Good to Great. And it's a great book. After you read Search Inside Yourself, read that book. That's a great book. And in that book, there was a study done on what makes companies go from good to great. Right? These are good companies. And then suddenly something happened to them, and they outperformed the market by 3x for like 10 to 15 years. So some significant amount of time. What changed? So the book was about the research behind that, and the number one thing that changed was leadership. The companies that went from good to great have a very specific kind of leader. And Jim Collins, the author of the research, calls them level 5 leaders. Or we call them good to great leaders. And there's something about good to great leaders, which is in addition to being competent CEOs, they have two characteristics, which is they are very ambitious and also they're personally very humble. So they're in a place where they are very ambitious, but their ambition is for the greater good. And because of that, they don't feel any need to glorify themselves, and therefore they become very inspiring for others, and therefore they're able to lead organizations to greatness. So humility, ambition and humility. If you look at compassion, and compassion is defined as this. It's defined as a mental state endowed with a sense of concern for the suffering of others and the aspiration to see the suffering relieved. And compassion, as Dan said, has 3 components. And so the definition I use is slightly different from Dan's, but it's almost identical. And the 3 components of compassion are, first, the affective component. I feel for you. Second, the cognitive component. I understand you. I see you. And the third component, most importantly, the motivational component, which is I want to help you. If you superimpose the 3 components of compassion with the 2 factors, the 2 qualities of level 5 leaders, you see a relationship. You see that the affective and the cognitive components of compassion downregulates the ego, downregulates self-importance, thereby creating the conditions for humility. And the motivational component of compassion creates the conditions for ambition for greater good. And therefore, I think that all level 5 leaders are compassionate leaders. And therefore, compassion is the necessary but insufficient component of level 5 leadership. So that's where it shows up. So first, if you have a compassionate leader, you're already at an advantage. Besides that, I don't have a lot of time left. Besides that, you have, when you have compassion, when it's widespread in the company, something else also happens, which is you create better customer service, right? Because now you treat customers like human beings. And if you treat customers well, they come back, you earn more money, right? You have better products because you're always thinking about what the user needs, what the customer needs. So that creates better products. And the other effect is you create inspired employees. People come to work and they know that all their co-workers are there to serve the greater good. They're all good people, right? They're all in the free time, they're raising money for hospitals. They're feeding, they're working in soup kitchens, and so on. And when they're not working at soup kitchens, they are working towards greater good in the company. And when that happens, you get employees who do not bite each other. That's the first thing. Less biting, good for business. And you create a kind of trust, which is very valuable. And there's a name for it. It's called vulnerability-based trust. And it's a kind of trust where people trust their coworkers enough to be vulnerable. They trust each other enough to be able to say, this project's not working out. I'm failing at this. I need help. Right? And so you get to the type of trust that Scott was just talking about. The type of trust that allows iterative speed and therefore successful companies. So in general, goodness is a competitive advantage in business, and specifically compassion is a very powerful competitive advantage. So that's two. The third thing about compassion is that it is highly trainable. Highly trainable. Like, it's so trainable, even I can do it. And the way to train compassion is this. The precursor, or the direct precursor to compassion, is kindness. So what's the difference? Compassion is wishing for others to be free from suffering. And there is, because of that, there's necessarily a motivational component. But before that, there's another frame of mind, which is wishing for others to be happy. Right? That doesn't necessarily carry a motivational component, but it is easier. And when you do that often enough, wishing for others to be happy, you like people, and when you like people enough, it organically becomes compassion. And the precursor, or one of the foundations of kindness and compassion, the foundation is inner joy. Because in my opinion, kindness and compassion are not sustainable unless they're based on inner joy. If you are joyful inside, independent of ego or pleasure, then you begin to be happy all the time. Then you begin to like people. And that sustains kindness, which sustains compassion. The foundation of that inner joy is inner peace. If you are able to calm your mind on demand, especially in challenging times, that peace will allow an inner joy to arise spontaneously. Over time, it becomes a skill. Over time, it's something that you can bring up on demand, and it dominates your life. And then it leads to inner joy, kindness, compassion. How do you train this? Very easy. I mean, it's not easy, but they are well known. The way to train inner peace, there are two aspects. The first aspect is learning to calm the mind. And the way to do that is mindfulness practice. Right? Bring attention to the breath. And every time you bring attention to the breath from wandering mind, you're strengthening the muscles of attention a little bit more. So when you do that enough, eventually you become you master the attention. Eventually you can bring the mind to the breath on demand. Eventually you can calm the mind on demand. That's the first half. The second half is self-knowledge. The type of self-knowledge that eventually leads to self-authenticity, that you become authentic about yourself. Then there's a certain element of inner peace that comes with that. So these two aspects. And the second aspect comes from mindfulness, again. So you get two for the price of one. Yes. After you train inner peace, the way to train inner joy is to, on top of inner peace, add in joy practices. And one easy way to do that is to become, aware aware of joyful experiences. For example, standing right here, I'm free from pain. And you think of free from pain, whatever, right? But when you're in pain, or when the toothache, oh my God, if I don't have this pain, I'll be so happy. And then when this pain goes away, after 3 days, you forget. Right? But if you imagine you don't forget, if you never forget, right now, this moment, I'm free from pain. There's some element of happiness. It can do more than that, right? Like there's air conditioning. It's not hot. That's happy. I'm with my friends. I'm happy, and so on. So you begin to notice all these small things. Eventually, you become sensitized towards it. And so if you do it on top of the mind that's already calm and clear, it orientates the mind towards joy. And eventually, it dominates the mind. And then you train kindness. And kindness is very easily trainable because all it takes is to train a mental habit. And the mental habit of kindness is to look at a human being, and the first thought is, I wish for this person to be happy. Right? I wish for this person to be happy. That's the first thought. It's the first thought. Why? Because it is a habit. And the way to train a habit is to do it a lot. Right? So randomly look at human beings and just think, I wish for this person to be happy. And you do that a lot, it becomes a habit. And habit becomes personality. Personality becomes character. Character becomes you. And just by training a habit, you become a person of kindness. And then on top of that, you train compassion. And compassion, there are two ways to do this, a non-meditative way and a meditative way. And I suggest doing both. The non-meditative way is very simple. Generosity. Right? Not just with money, but also with your attention, with your kindness, with your time, with heart. The tradition I came from, Buddhism, we have something called the 10 parameters, the 10 perfections, which we all train in. The number one perfection is generosity. And it has been argued, and I agree, that the other 9 parameters are just commentary on the first one. So if you train that one thing, generosity, to perfection, everything else falls into place. The second half of the training for compassion is a practice called Tonglen, which is a little bit of a technical subject. But the short version of it is when in meditation, visualize yourself taking in the suffering of yourself and of other people, converting it into goodness, and then give out the goodness to the world. And thereby training 3 mental habits. The first mental habit is, I am willing to accept suffering. The second mental habit is, I am able to transform suffering into goodness. And the third mental habit is, I am willing to give goodness to the world. And that is a complete package that goes from inner peace to compassion. So in conclusion, my friends, just remember these 3 things. Remember that compassion is fun, profitable, and highly trainable. And remember the way to train it, which is inner peace, inner joy, kindness, compassion. And then when you do that, you will be even more effective, becoming a vector of compassion for the world. Thank you.
We have some microphones moving around if you have questions for our panelists. And while you have a moment to gather your thoughts, I'm thinking about this relationship between generosity on the one hand and scarcity on the other hand. And I think there's a wonderful discussion between Paul's bringing to life that scarcity mentality and the grasping that goes along with the scarcity mentality. There's some wonderful new research in the past couple of years summarized in a book entitled Scarcity, with a behavioral economics point of view about what happens to us in many different ways, psychologically, spiritually, and cognitively when we think we're encountering scarcity. So I'm wondering if you have comments on the thought about this relationship between generosity and scarcity, and also the underlying drivers of some of these findings could be that when we see an increase in financial or physical materials in our life, we have a kind of corresponding sense of attention scarcity or time scarcity, so something else becomes scarce instead. And I know I'm asking you to speculate away from the data, but I wonder if that provokes any thoughts for anyone on the panel.
I don't know that I'm particularly well suited to comment, but I think it's a really provocative question. And I think with regards to what we've been finding, and Scott and I were talking about this earlier, there's lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of reasons to think about how resources are, by definition, valuable. We want them, they're good for us, they're good for our lives. They help us get the things that we want, to put food on the table, to care for the people that we care about, to care for others around us. Money is incredibly valuable, and it buys us a lot of good things. It buys us control, it buys us better health, it buys us better access to all sorts of resources that we value, all kinds of really privileged goods. So my talk was by no means meant to be a depiction of money as bad, but that with money comes certain kinds of social costs. And one of the costs, you mentioned, you gestured to this, Monica, but one of the things that I would say is that money buys you space. Money buys you psychological distance. It means that you can take care of yourself, but it also means that you're not necessarily as needing to rely on others. You're in more control over your own life. You're less needing of your social relationships, social bonds to get the things that you want. And even on a tactile level, money buys you a bigger home, potentially. There's more distance between your bedroom and the bedroom of other people in your home. You might have a bigger yard, so there's more physical distance between yourself and other people. When you get to work, maybe you're less likely to carpool. And when you get to work, you're more likely to carpool on your way to work, and when you get to work, you may be less likely to work as a member of a team, and be more likely to be supervising people from above. So in all sorts of different ways, psychologically and physically, money and wealth can grant you freedom and space, and with that increased social distance come potentially some of the things that we've been documenting. But I'd love to hear other people's thoughts.
I don't know how to phrase this. I'm going to say in a way that will sound strange, which is that to some degree, scarcity is in the mind. Scarcity and abundance are in the mind. And why do I think so? If you look at the source of the feeling of scarcity and abundance, I think there are two sources. The first is sense pleasure, and is flip side, sensual pain. Then sense suffering. The other one is ego pleasure and ego suffering. And it's because we are sensitized to these two things that things become scarce, right? The more things we acquire, the more we are free from sensual pain and more sensual pleasure. And then also the ego, right? The more things I have, the more people look at me and think I'm important, the more ego I feel is important, and vice versa. And I think it's these two things that drive us to have this scarcity mindset, mentality. That's why we acquire more and more. And if we break it down and we look at it, I would think that the physical aspect, the sense pleasure, sense pain aspect is easier to solve in modern society because we already have enough food, we already have clothing and housing. The other part is harder. So the solution, first is the awareness of this. The second is, I think, with mindfulness practice. If you're able to develop inner joy, inner peace and inner joy, for example, that alone means that your need for ego pleasure has gone all the way down. And then it enables the abundance mindset. And then when you have the abundance mindset, you start giving away more, people love you more, and you derive joy from that. And then the ego needs goes even lower, and it becomes a positive virtuous cycle. So in a sense, it's all in the mind.
Other questions?
Hi, gentlemen. Thank you for today. This question is for Meng and Paul. I would like a spiritual perspective and then a business perspective. Meng, you talked about hold on, the self-knowledge that leads to authenticity. And in that journey, there's such a fine line of ego-ness that comes because you feel like, this is me. Now, how do you suggest that we work with that so that we can go past the ego to get to the authentic self with the self, and then be able to portray that authentic self in the business culture? And that would be for Paul.
Okay. Unfortunately, it's a long answer. So I give you, there's a simple version and there's a harder version. The easy version is kindness and compassion. So when you give people more kindness and compassion, then there's more relatedness. And then more and more of your joy arises from those connections. And when that happens, you might find yourself feeling less and less self-important, because now you're feeling part of a greater whole, this web relationship. And that's when the ego starts to become less and less important. So that's the easy part. There's a more advanced one. And this is where we get to advanced topics. And every time I say advanced topics, it's a keyword. It means everything I say from now on is BS. until you try out for yourself, and then you verify to be true. Yes. Otherwise, it's BS. And the advanced topic is this. It is that the self is not an object. Self is a process. And because self is a process, self is created entirely by mind. And therefore, if once you develop the ability to perceive that self not arising, like half of life's ego problems go away. And the way to do that is this. Again, this is a suggestion. It's BS until it's proven true to yourself. Is, when you fall asleep, right, sometimes you dream. And then when you dream, you have a different identity altogether, right? And so between falling asleep and having a new identity, one identity was being dropped, the other one was being taken up. So in between, there's a state where there's no identity. There's only the observer. And so the way to do this is when your stability of attention becomes so strong that as you fall asleep, you are able to remain conscious as the identity is abandoned by the mind and stay there. And then you will see that there is no identity. It's entirely self-made. And then there is the breakthrough. But it goes more, by the way. This is only the first step. But there's a breakthrough into, first breakthrough into no self. Your question for Paul?
Paul or Scott would comment on authenticity from a business point of view?
I have a belief called first to offer. And that's sort of a leadership obligation, but it's a personal obligation or responsibility, which is, my analogy is it's kind of like the high school dance. At the beginning, the girls are on one side and the boys are on the other side, and everyone's afraid. And so that vulnerability, as Meng talked about it, the person who first walks across the gym floor in front of all the other kids and takes the risk that they will be rejected when they get to the other side. And in fact, of course, as we know, they're not, but is willing to do that, and then steps out onto the dance floor, and of course, 5 minutes later, everyone's dancing. And I think authenticity and that vulnerability, the willingness or the ability or the comfort or the reassurance to let down the guard and just be is not far from the surface. And if somebody takes that walk across the proverbial dance floor first, they're not going to be out there for long. And that's a powerful centrifugal force. But it does take somebody taking the first step. So I can't make it as complicated as Meng can. And I don't know what that does to your identity. But it does a lot of good things in my experience.
Well, I hope we have a chance to continue this dialogue and this conversation throughout the rest of our time together. Thank you for your generosity of time and ideas today.